Picture a medieval town square in the early morning. A crowd watches quietly as a hooded figure slowly raises a heavy axe over a wooden block. Who is this person with the axe? What is their story, and how does someone become an executioner? Today, we'll explore what it was like to be an executioner in the Middle Ages, their daily life, their place in society, and how others treated them. In medieval times, the executioner was a strange contradiction. Society needed them, but everyone hated them. On one hand, they did an important job. They carried out death sentences from courts and rulers, making sure justice was done. On the other hand, people looked at executioners with fear and disgust because of their bloody work. People thought executioners were dirty and without honor. They believed the executioner was stained with blood, so society pushed them to the edges of town. Most people wouldn't even talk to them. Nobody chose to become an executioner willingly. The job had such a bad reputation that no one wanted it. So how did people end up in this role? Sometimes a butcher became an executioner because they were already used to killing animals. Sometimes a criminal sentenced to death was offered mercy if they agreed to do this unwanted work instead of dying. Most commonly, the job passed from father to son. Executioner families often worked in the same city for many generations. But this wasn't about family honor. It was about having no other choice. Once a family was marked by this profession, other jobs were closed to them. The executioner's children couldn't join guilds or find other work, so they had to continue the family business whether they wanted to or not. Executioners and their families lived completely separated from normal society. They usually lived outside the city walls or by the city gates, where the town council made them stay so regular citizens wouldn't have to see them every day. No decent person would invite an executioner to their home for dinner. In church, executioners had to sit in a separate area if they were allowed inside at all. Some places didn't let executioners attend religious services at all. They had to get married in private ceremonies outside the church. Old stories say that an executioner could only marry a woman who was sentenced to death. He could offer marriage instead of execution. But many women supposedly chose death rather than marry an executioner. Whether these stories are true or not, executioner families definitely had trouble finding spouses outside their own community. They often married other executioner families because everyone else saw them as cursed and unworthy. Since executioners were needed but hated, rulers gave them some special rights to make up for their terrible reputation and keep them working. These included something called havage. Executioners could take some food and drink from the market without paying. Many places also gave executioner families free housing and didn't make them pay taxes. These small benefits were meant to make their isolated lives easier and encourage them to stay in a job they might otherwise quit. This created a strange situation where executioners were both needed and despised at the same time. People had mixed feelings. The executioner ensured justice and order, but their presence reminded everyone of death and violence. It's no surprise that executioner families became friends with other outcasts, prostitutes, beggars, criminals, and lepers. For regular citizens, the executioner and their family remained suspicious and unclean people. In medieval times, the church and government worked closely together, which affected how punishment worked. Court cases and executions often had religious meaning. The Christian church taught mercy, but also saw punishment as God's justice. The death penalty was considered right, for serious sins and crimes. In the High Middle Ages, people could be executed for crimes against religion, like eating meat during Lent or refusing to be baptized. Religion gave moral reasons for harsh punishments. If someone seriously sinned against God or the church, the death penalty was seen as protecting other souls and warning against evil. From a political view, executions were public shows of power. When law enforcement was weak and many criminals escaped punishment, rulers needed to show the strength of law through scary examples. When they finally caught and sentenced someone, the execution became a public show, proving that the ruler's authority was real and unstoppable. The executioner played an important political role as the extended hand of the ruler's justice, an instrument carrying out God's and the king's anger on wrongdoers. We usually imagine executioners as rough, strong men with axes, but in reality, this job required considerable skill and knowledge. The executioner wasn't just a killer, he was a craftsman of death who had to perfectly master execution techniques, know human anatomy, and often understand healing and torture. His job was to carry out sentences as efficiently and cleanly as possible, without unnecessary suffering or public scandal. A failed execution was a disaster for everyone. If the executioner was clumsy and made the condemned person suffer longer or caused bloody chaos, he could be accused of cruelty. In some places, executioners had only 3 tries with a sword or axe to complete a beheading. If the condemned person still had their head after that, the executioner faced punishment or attack by angry crowds. There are records of angry spectators attacking executioners when executions went too badly, and authorities could then punish the executioner with reduced pay, jail time, or firing. Since the craft often passed from father to son, there was long training within the family. The young future executioner learned animal and human anatomy, helped at executions, and gradually tried easier tasks. A famous example is Franz Schmidt, an executioner from the 16th century. As a young man, he practiced his skills on dead bodies and animals before being allowed to execute his first human. According to records, he first cut off heads of cabbages and pumpkins, then had to prove his accuracy on a condemned dog, and only after success in these tests did his father trust him with an actual execution. The executioner's tools were varied and matched the type of punishment. Most famous is the sword or axe for beheading, mainly used for nobles or when decapitation was ordered. Hanging used a gallows and strong rope, common punishment for thieves and robbers. Hanging was considered more shameful than beheading and punished lower crimes and social classes. The executioner could also use the wheel, breaking on the wheel, where the condemned was tied to a large wheel, and the executioner broke their bones with blows. Burning at the stake was for witches, heretics, or those accused of magic. Drowning was used for women convicted of killing their babies. Each region and time period had different methods of capital punishment. Besides killing, executioners also tortured people during questioning. They were called to use torture instruments to break suspects and force confessions. Here, too, they had to be careful masters. The goal was to cause maximum pain, but keep the victim alive so they could confess and go to trial. Executioners needed knowledge of anatomy and medicine to know where to apply torture without causing early death. At the same time, they had to keep wounded prisoners alive. If torture caused injuries, the executioner had to treat and heal them so the condemned could later be executed in full health. This strange contradiction, the executioner as both destroyer and healer, was common in medieval justice. Through all this work, executioners often gained extraordinary knowledge about the human body. Many became well educated for their time, learning to read partly for studying legal rules and execution manuals, and partly for studying healing arts. Ironically, some executioners became sought-after healers and doctors. People wouldn't normally associate with executioners, but when it came to health, they often secretly came to their houses for medicine or advice. Executioners had access to unique sources of medicine, like fat from executed bodies or powder from ground bones, which were valued in folk medicine. What was an ordinary day like for someone whose job was killing? Surprisingly, executioners could spend many days quite normally. Executions weren't daily events. Executioners, especially in smaller towns, often did many other jobs to make a living. They worked as animal waste collectors and street cleaners, removed dead animals from streets, cleaned city sewers, caught stray dogs, or even supervised brothels. The city gave them these unpleasant tasks partly because no one else wanted to do them, and also because they fit the executioner's unclean reputation. Executioner families lived in isolation together. The executioner's wife didn't have it easy. Executioner women were often accused of witchcraft or dealing with dark forces, perhaps because of their closeness to death. Executioner children grew up knowing other kids didn't want to play with them, and at school other parents looked down on them, if the school accepted them at all. Some executioners, especially in larger cities, managed to make decent money. They received payment for each execution and torture session, plus income from side jobs. And because they paid no taxes, they could afford a solid living. An executioner could be richer than ordinary craftsmen, even though those craftsmen wouldn't drink beer with him. Medieval society had a different relationship with death and executions than we do today. Executions were public events and part of the culture of life and death. The execution site, gallows on a hill outside the city, was a symbolic place that inspired fear. The execution itself had a set routine. The condemned often got a chance to speak final words to the crowd, perhaps confessing guilt or cursing their judges. The executioner had his established ceremony, calling out the sentence 3 times, blowing a horn, or using symbols like the executioner's sword. After beheading, the executioner showed the head to the crowd so everyone could see that the sentence was carried out. Sometimes heads were stuck on spikes and displayed on walls or bridges as warning signs for potential criminals. Contrary to popular belief, it wasn't always just a bloodthirsty show for a cheering crowd. Often the ceremony had a serious and moral tone. People felt compassion or fear. The execution reminded them of life's shortness and the power of law. After executions, many superstitions appeared around the executed person's body. Parts of criminals' bodies were taken as lucky charms. A hanged man's hand supposedly brought luck in gambling. Rope from gallows was worn for protection. Fat from hanged men was used in medicine for joint pain. People sometimes went to execution sites to collect soil soaked with blood, believing it had healing power. The executioner played the role of keeper of these items, whether officially or secretly. Today, the profession of executioner no longer exists in the original sense. In most countries, public execution is history, and the death penalty has either been abolished or is carried out privately behind prison walls. Nevertheless, the image of the medieval executioner lives on in culture, films, and literature. We often see a tall man in a black hood with an axe, a silent executor of orders. This image comes more from later imagination than reality. Medieval executioners mostly didn't hide their faces since everyone knew who they were. The figure appears in modern games and books. For example, in the Czech game Kingdom Come, Deliverance, there's an executioner character who struggles with loneliness, and the player helps him find a bride, referring to the real difficulty executioners had finding partners. Being an executioner in the Middle Ages meant living in extremes, on the border between life and death, inside and outside society. The executioner was a mirror of their time, a time that was both cruel and religious. These people served the law, often unwillingly, and performed horrible tasks so others could live safely, at least according to the ideas of that time. They were necessary but hated, needed but despised. The medieval executioner shows us the raw reality of the past, where justice mixed with cruelty and faith. Their story reminds us how much our understanding of justice and human dignity has changed over the centuries. Thank you for joining this journey into a dark chapter of history that still fascinates us today. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe the channel. See you next time.